Welcome back to Awake. This second facet, the false identity, is vital to understand. This is where we look at what went wrong in the story of humanity and what our core problem really is. So last time we talked about the eternal prequel, the great story before our story, that before time and space there was the divine family, and together they birthed this universe, and we as their children were the crown jewel of creation, made to walk in love and to reign over the creation in relationship with God. And you could see hints of this today, right? You can see our incredible potential for love and compassion and unity. You can also see the authority and the power that we can exert over the elements. But of course, you can also see other things. In our world, you see a major breakdown of love and a perversion of power. We live in a world filled with war. There's war between nations, war between races, war between brothers and sisters, between spouses, between our own souls, even within our physical bodies, between red blood cells and viruses. There's war and division everywhere, and all of it leads to death in one form or another. Some people, most people, have accepted this as reality. It is what it is, goes the expression. But I want you to know that this is not reality. This is a false reality. It's a dream world we've created because we have fallen asleep to the truth. Now, if you were to look at all the different problems in the world, kind of like fruit hanging from a tree, the real problem is not the fruit. The issue is the root system underneath. People always want to fight the fruit, the issues in their immediate vision. But if you do that, the fruit always comes back without dealing with the root system. And there is this hidden root system that produces all these fruits of death and division in this world. To understand this root system, we're going to go back to the book of Genesis, which is a book of origins, and we're going to look at the story of the Garden of Eden. Now, you might be listening to this, and maybe you don't take 1 ounce of the story of Adam and Eve literally. But whether you do or not, its message cuts to the literal heart of every human being on this planet, and it calls for our attention. The story is both simple and strange. There's a serpent in it, a creature of deception that comes to humanity who is summed up in Adam and Eve. God puts Adam and Eve in this beautiful garden and tells them that they are free to enjoy the entire garden. No heavy restriction, no religious control or fear, just wide open abundance for them to enjoy and feast upon. In fact, the word Eden is the Hebrew word for pleasure. It was literally called the Garden of Pleasure. That's what we were made for. Now, that said, there was one tree that they were not to eat from, and that was the tree of right and wrong, which we'll unpack more a little later. God told them, if you eat from that tree, death will be the result. So this is for your protection, God is saying, because I love you, not because I want to control you. But the serpent comes and asks Eve a question in the story. Did God really say that you couldn't eat from any tree in the garden? Now, he's already trying to twist her mind there and make her think that God is stingy and holding out on her. So Eve responds. She says, no, we can eat from just about any tree out there, but there is one that's unhealthy for us. If we eat from that one, we'll die. And the serpent responds, you won't die. In fact, God is holding out on you because he knows that if you eat from that tree, you will become like him, and he doesn't want that. Well, right there, the serpent is presenting Eve with a subtle but powerful lie. He's insinuating that if she wants to be like God, then she has to eat from that tree. And she takes the bait. She bites into the lie. And this is where we get at the deception that is underneath all the world's problems. You see, There are two lies happening here at once. The first lie was about her identity. Eve believed that she wasn't like God and that she needed to do something to become like her father. But Eve was already made in the likeness of God, if you read the first chapter of the story. So what happened here is that Eve began to believe less of herself. She began to believe that she was not a true child of the Trinity. She lost sight of who she was and began to feel a separation between her and her Creator. Now, the second lie was also about identity, but this one was about God's identity. See, our view of God became distorted in that moment. Just like we lost sight of who we are, we lost sight of who our Father is, and we began to doubt His heart, His intentions. We began to doubt that He was good. And believing this lie produced distrust. And trust is the currency of relationship. If you lose trust in a relationship, that relationship goes bankrupt. And the only way to restore it is to start filling the account up with trust again. So humanity lost trust in God's nature, in His goodness and love, which meant we lost the relationship. And this was not on His end. This was because of the lie we bit into. And that lie destroyed the whole world. And I know that might sound overly simplistic to you when you look at the overwhelming problems in society, like how can believing these simple lies affect all of civilization? Well, as a counselor and a social worker, I could tell you that small things like events that occur in people's childhood, where they come to believe a certain lie about themselves because of an abuser or a manipulator, a serpent, those things can set the entire course of someone's life in the wrong direction. One little root can produce a whole harvest of bad fruit. And that's what happened to our entire world. So imagine a straight line on a piece of paper, and all of a sudden you let that line deviate ever so slightly, 1 degree. At first, it will still seem somewhat straight, but as it goes out, that little deviation will eventually veer off its path. When we bought into these lies about God and ourselves, that slowly led us away from the original line of blessing. And with that deviation of truth, we began to live out of a false identity, and we recreated God or the gods in our own broken image. And that produced all the opposites of love and life and peace in this world. So in the first facet of Awake, I brought up the movie The Matrix. In that movie, there's this false world put over the eyes of humanity, and it's a powerful image of what happened to us. We fell asleep into a false reality that became a world in and of itself, a dream world built on the wrong foundation, built on lies. This formed a new reality of division and death, which again is really a false reality. So people like to throw around the word sin, and this is a word that can mean different things to different people. A lot of people think it, has to do with breaking religious rules, kind of going against God's holy law book or something. But the word sin in the original Hebrew language that it was written in simply means to miss the mark. And that goes back to that small deviation in the line. We were made to stay on a clear path of peace and true pleasure. We were made to live out of our true identity as beloved sons and daughters of the Trinity, ruling over creation with justice and goodness. On top of that, we were made to enjoy the happiness and friendship of our triune God. But we veered away from that, and that is what sin is. So instead of the English word sin, I'm using the phrase the false identity. Because that's really what happened. We embraced a false understanding of ourselves and God, and that led down this path to all the bad fruit we see today. So right now, I want to unpack more of the kinds of bad fruit I'm talking about. I want to give you 5 types of fruit or effects that came from this original root system of an identity crisis. And these are all things that all of us have experienced in one way or another. Okay? So the first type of fruit is guilt. All right, back in the story of the garden, after they ate from the tree, Adam and Eve run from God. They hide in the bushes. Now, God didn't run from them. You can read the story for yourself. God didn't hide his face from them in anger. In the story, God actually pursues them. The reason we hid was because of guilt. We did something wrong. And what guilt does is it isolates us from others, and it leads us into all kinds of destructive patterns. All right, any psychologist worth their salt will tell you that guilt and shame are at the heart of so many emotional and psychological problems. Yes, there's genetics, there's chemical imbalances that affect us, but there is a deep element of guilt that empowers those imbalances and all the generational cyclical problems that occur in people's lives and actions. One of the things guilt does is it creates fear. And we became afraid of God in our minds. You see, what happened was we lost sight of the smile on his face, the kindness in his heart. We forgot the happiness or the joy of his presence. In this new, twisted reality, we began to make God the villain of the story. And this is the great tragedy of this world, that we have so misunderstood the character of God. And that has in turn driven us away from the very source of joy itself. All right, the second fruit from this lie is what we'll call the false self. So when God finds Adam and Eve in the bushes of fear, they use a fig leaf to cover up their nakedness. See, because of guilt and shame, we now felt like we had to cover ourselves up. We had to make up for the lack we now felt in ourselves, or you could say the evil we now saw in ourselves, even though that wasn't our true identity. And this is what we do all the time. We put on masks. We pretend to be something we're not. We fake it till we make it, which goes all the way back to identity, because we feel less than. So we're trying to make ourselves look better than we feel. Now remember, we were made as the glorious and loved children of the divine. But because we believed that we lost that relationship, which was a lie, we now felt this gaping hole in ourselves. And with that came the need to cover it up. So now you have men throughout the world who put on the tough guy image just out of deep insecurity. You have women altering their own image for the same reasons. Both men and women, we cling to whatever good thing we can find in ourselves, whether it's intelligence or humor or looks, whatever. We take one gift and hide behind it out of a fear of being exposed in other areas. And that produces a whole load of problems, other problems that have plagued the world for generations. All right, a third fruit from this ancient lie is a very important one to talk about. It's the fruit of self-effort. Okay? Once we believed we were less than and that we were separate from God, we became filled with this insatiable hunger to become good enough, to become worthy of love. And this is huge. This is how religion was birthed. Okay, religion is man's efforts to become right. In other words, to become good and acceptable by the works we do. And so I'm in full agreement with many strong atheists out there who say religion is a problem. Okay, religion in and of itself is a problem. We weren't made for religion in this sense. We were made for life and joy. And all the striving produces anxiety, right? It leads to this restlessness where we're not measuring up, which also takes us into perfectionism. And that can then lead to depression, and that, of course, can lead to things like suicide. And that's actually sometimes why religious people obsess over going to heaven. They want out of this world because they're exhausted, when really they haven't woken up to the true life God designed for them. In many cases, that's what happens. Now, another type of fruit that came out of this great identity crisis is what I'll call a dust mindset. All right, the scriptures say that because man bit into that lie, he would return to the dust. And that is literally true, but it's also symbolic. Mankind was born from the dust of this earth, right? We came out of the chemicals and processes of the universe. But we were made to be more than dust. We were made divine. But when we bit into that lie, we began to see ourselves as mere dust. At best, we saw ourselves as just highly evolved primates filled with complex chemical bonding. And because of that limited perspective, we often treat each other like animals. We treat each other and ourselves like dust. Okay, any person who abuses their own body, who cuts themselves, or takes substances that damage their being, they're under the influence of this lie. They're living in this dream world, the matrix, where you don't see who you really are. And when we abuse others, it's the same thing. When someone spits on another person, they're seeing them as nothing more than dust. All right, racism that looks at the outer skin of a person is the same problem. And things like rape, or even just lusting after another person's body, yet not caring for their soul, that is another ugly effect from this. When we don't see who we truly are and who others are, it deforms our behavior. And it turns the garden of life into a wilderness of despair. Now, the last fruit from this ancient lie is perhaps the most powerful. It's what we'll call the orphan spirit. Did you know that the most common denominator in the statistics of men in prison has nothing to do with things like race or even the crime itself? The most common thread that runs across men in prison is fatherlessness. It's that they didn't have an active, healthy dad in their lives. That is a small but powerful picture of a much larger reality affecting the whole human race. You see, this great lie about ourselves and the resulting distrust toward God led us to feel rejected and abandoned by God. Because when you feel guilty and you can't handle the guilt, you start to blame shift. You start to put the onus on others. But God never rejected us. In fact, He came after us. Even when we left the garden, God continued to pursue us over and over again. You see this all throughout Scripture. But we felt rejected in our own minds. And so we began to believe that we are all alone. We are just orphans floating on a strange rock without a father or mother. And hey, if I'm alone, then I'm going to be a survivor. I'm going to do it my way. And hence you have the story of so many lonely and ambitious people trying to prove themselves, trying to make their way through life, even at the expense of others. It's with this sense of being alone that anger and resentment also emerges. And just like many of those people in prison resent their earthly dads, humankind began to resent her heavenly parent. Now, a lot of people express this resentment by saying, God, you don't exist. Even though the existence of the divine is obvious. But we became blind to it out of this hidden anger that many choose to deny, but is there connected to that sense of rejection. So, anyway, these fruits or effects, okay? Guilt, the false self, self-effort, a dust mindset, an orphan spirit. These things are behind the major problems in our lives. And as hard as it might be to believe, all of them stem back to those simple lies about identity. We were deceived about the true goodness of God and our true identity in His image. And that led to all these kinds of behavior, all this false stuff, which evolved into entire lifestyles of darkness. And it became ingrained into our bloodlines, our cultures, and our religions. I mentioned counseling before, and many of the leading theories in counseling have to do with how our thoughts impact our behavior. This is nothing revolutionary. It's just the way the mind works. It rises or falls on the truth. But here's the good news. Here's the glorious reality. There is a way out of this broken line of sin, this false identity. There is a way back into true life, into original blessing. The truth is that our divine family, the Creator, did not abandon us. He provided a way back to Eden, even for our lives right here and now. And that's what we're going to start getting into in the rest of a week.